Alright, think about this. I'm looking at something that looks completely inedible, maybe even disgusting to modern eyes. But this exact substance kept entire medieval villages alive through the worst famines in European history. And there are 9 more things just like it that medieval peasants could find anywhere. Things that modern survivalists walk past every single day without realizing they're looking at dinner. Here's what's fascinating. When crops failed in medieval times, which happened regularly, peasants didn't just starve. They had a whole system of backup foods that seem impossible to us today. While modern preppers stockpile canned goods and freeze-dried meals, medieval people could walk into any forest, even in winter, and find enough food to survive for months. This wasn't luck, this was knowledge. Deep, systematic knowledge passed down through generations and refined by the brutal feedback of starvation. They weren't just eating weird stuff out of desperation. They had actual techniques, preparation methods, and safety protocols that turned poison into nutrition. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what they knew. 10 categories of impossible food that don't look like food at all, how they prepared each one safely, and why these techniques meant the difference between life and death when everything else failed. By the end of this video, you'll never look at a dead tree the same way again. The hidden bread factory. Let's start with the most important one, tree bark. Not the hard, crusty outer bark that you see, but what's hidden underneath. Medieval peasants called this famine bread, and it literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives during climate disasters. Here's something that will blow your mind. There's actually a Native American tribe called the Adirondack, and that word literally translates to bark eaters in the Iroquois language. This wasn't some desperate last resort. This was sophisticated survival technology. Trees have 8 different layers, but only one is edible. It's called the cambium layer, a thin, almost transparent membrane right between the outer bark and the wood. This is where all the tree's nutrients flow up and down the trunk. Think of it as the tree's bloodstream, packed with sugars and starches. Here's the critical part. You never ring bark a living tree because that kills it. Medieval foragers knew to cut vertical strips about an inch wide. Use your knife to score through the outer bark, then peel it back. What you're looking for is this white, almost rubbery layer that should come off in long strips. Medieval people developed 3 main preparation methods. First, raw consumption. You can chew it immediately like gum, swallowing the sweet juices and spitting out the fiber. Medieval accounts describe it as surprisingly sweet from the tree's natural sugars. Second, bark bacon. Cut the cambium into strips and fry them in whatever fat you have until they turn reddish brown and get crispy. Chronicles describe the texture as remarkably like bacon and the taste as nutty and pleasant. Third, bark flour. Dry the strips completely over a fire, then pound them into powder using stones. Scandinavian records show they mixed this with grain, typically 1/3 bark flour to 2/3 grain flour. Not all trees work the same way. Medieval sources consistently mention elm as the best choice. It has the thickest cambium layer and actually improves bread texture. Pine was second choice because it's everywhere and easy to harvest. Birch was third, sweet but thin. Critical safety note, always avoid anything you can't positively identify, and never use cherry, yew, or any tree with milky sap. These contain cyanogenic compounds that can be lethal. Regional variations were significant. In Scandinavia, particularly among the Sami people, pine bark was processed differently. They would collect large sheets in spring when the sap was rising, dry them in special bark sheds, and grind them in dedicated quernstones. This produced a finer flour that was mixed with reindeer milk. In contrast, Germanic tribes preferred beech cambium, which they would ferment slightly before drying to improve digestibility and reduce the natural bitterness. Cambium provides about 500–600 calories per pound, but more importantly, it contains significant amounts of calcium, potassium, and vitamin C-, crucial nutrients during extended periods of scarcity. Pine cambium specifically contains alpha-pinene compounds that have antimicrobial properties, which may have helped prevent scurvy during long winters. Mushrooms on dead trees. Now, if you're looking at dead trees for bark, you might as well know about the other food source hiding there, mushrooms. But medieval people had a completely different approach to mushroom foraging than we do today. Here's the genius part. Medieval foragers focused almost exclusively on mushrooms that grow on dead wood. Why? Because while many edible mushrooms grow from soil, so do the really deadly ones like deathcap, but mushrooms that grow on trees, much safer bet. Medieval people knew three reliable species that were virtually impossible to misidentify. Oyster mushrooms grow in shelf-like clusters on dead hardwoods. They called them tree ears. They're distinctive because of their shell-like shape and overlapping growth pattern. Chicken of the woods was prized because it literally tastes like chicken when cooked. It grows in bright orange and yellow brackets only on oak and other hardwoods. Chaga looks like a black burnt mass on birch trees and was used for both food and medicine. Medieval foragers had strict safety protocols. Never collect anything they hadn't seen their elders eat multiple times. Always cook mushrooms that grow on wood, even the safe ones, because cooking breaks down potential toxins and makes them easier to digest. They would slice the mushrooms and either add them directly to stews or dry them by hanging near the fire for several days until completely crisp. Fresh mushrooms were usually added to whatever stew the family was making, but medieval people developed sophisticated preservation methods. For drying, they would slice mushrooms thin and dry them over the fire, or in rare sunshine. Dried mushrooms last for months, and the process concentrates flavors. For smoking, they would hang mushrooms in their smokehouses, along with meat, which not only preserved them but added rich, smoky flavors that made them valuable trade items. Regional differences were notable. In Eastern Europe, particularly among Slavic peoples, there was extensive knowledge of tree fungi, including species like honey mushrooms that grow in massive clusters on dying hardwoods. These were often pickled in brine made from oak leaves, which added tannins that helped preservation. In contrast, Celtic traditions focused more on bracket fungi, which they would dry into hard chips that could be reconstituted months later. Nutritionally, these wood-growing mushrooms provided crucial B vitamins, particularly B12, which was otherwise scarce in plant-based diets. Chaga specifically contains betulinic acid and melanin compounds that modern research shows have immune-supporting properties. Medieval people called it the gift of the forest for good reason. Poisonous seeds and nuts. The third category is where medieval knowledge really shines. Seeds and nuts that are literally toxic in their raw form, but become nutritious powerhouses with the right processing. Every oak tree produces hundreds of pounds of acorns each year. From a nutritional standpoint, they're incredible, packed with calories, protein, and healthy fats. But raw acorns will make you violently ill because of compounds called tannins. Medieval people mastered removing these toxins through leaching. First collect and shell the acorns, then grind them coarsely using stones. For cold water leaching, put the ground acorns in woven baskets and submerge them in running streams for days or weeks. The flowing water gradually carries away the bitter compounds. For hot water leaching, boil the acorn meal repeatedly, dumping the bitter brown water and adding fresh water each time until it runs clear. Stinging nettles produce incredibly nutritious seeds packed with protein and essential fatty acids. Wait until late summer when the seed heads are brown but haven't dropped yet. Then use a basket to knock the seeds off the plants. Roast nettle seeds like coffee beans until they're golden brown. They develop a rich, nutty flavor and can be eaten as a snack or ground into protein-rich flour. These common weeds produce massive quantities of tiny seeds that medieval people harvested systematically. Cut the seed heads when they're brown and dry, then beat them in baskets to separate seeds from chaff. The key safety consideration with acorns is proper identification of oak species. Red oak acorns contain higher tannin levels and require more extensive leaching than white oak acorns. Medieval foragers could distinguish between them by taste. White oak acorns are noticeably less bitter, even raw. They also knew that acorns from trees growing in rich, moist soil were generally less bitter than those from dry, rocky areas. Regional processing methods varied significantly. Korean Buddhist monks developed a technique using multiple clay vessels in sequence, allowing the leaching water to gradually become cleaner through each stage. Native American tribes in California used specially woven baskets lined with pine pitch, creating a more efficient leaching system. Some European regions fermented acorns slightly before leaching, which partially broke down the tannins and created more complex flavors. Nutritionally, processed acorn flour is remarkably complete. It contains about 380 calories per 100 grams, with 6% protein, 4% fat, and significant amounts of manganese, copper, and magnesium. The protein quality is excellent, containing all essential amino acids in ratios superior to many grains. Nettle seeds are even more impressive nutritionally. They contain up to 25% protein and are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, making them one of the most complete wild plant proteins available. Roots and tubers. The fourth category takes us underground to roots and tubers that don't look like anything you'd want to eat, but medieval peasants knew exactly when and how to harvest them. Burdock is that plant with the burrs that stick to your clothes, but medieval people knew that first-year roots are not only edible, but genuinely tasty. Timing is everything. You want first-year plants that haven't flowered yet because the roots of older plants become woody and bitter. Medieval foragers would mark patches of young burdock in spring and return in fall when the roots had stored up energy for winter. Scrub the roots clean, peel off the outer layer, and slice them. They can be boiled, roasted, or added to stews, with a sweet, earthy flavor similar to parsnips. Dandelion roots were crucial, especially in early spring, when other food stores were running low. The trick is timing. Harvest them in early spring, before the plant flowers, when the roots are full of stored energy. Medieval people would roast dandelion roots until they turned dark brown, then grind them into a coffee-like drink. The roasted roots are bitter, but nutritious and provided a warming drink during cold months. These aren't actually artichokes, they're tubers from a native sunflower that medieval people called earth apples. The plants look like small sunflowers and grow in patches. The tubers form underground and can be harvested in fall after the plants die back. They're sweet and crunchy and can be eaten raw like water chestnuts or cooked like potatoes. Safe identification was crucial for root vegetables. Medieval foragers taught their children to recognize plants by their above-ground characteristics during growing season, then mark productive areas for later harvest. They knew that burdock leaves are large and heart-shaped with a rough, fuzzy texture on the underside. Dandelions have their distinctive jagged leaves, but the key identifier was the thick white taproot that exudes a milky sap when cut. Jerusalem artichokes were identified by their tall sunflower-like stalks and small yellow flowers. Storage and preservation methods varied by region and root type. In areas with mild winters, many roots could be left in the ground and harvested as needed, a technique called ground storage. For harsh climates, roots were often stored in underground cellars lined with straw or sand. Some communities developed sophisticated root clamps, underground storage pits lined with stones and covered with thick layers of earth and straw that maintained consistent temperatures just above freezing. The nutritional profiles of these wild roots were often superior to cultivated vegetables. Burdock root contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber that supports digestive health, along with significant amounts of potassium and antioxidants. Dandelion root is exceptionally high in vitamins A and C, plus iron and calcium. Jerusalem artichokes are unique among vegetables for their high inulin content, up to 20% by weight, which provides sustained energy and supports beneficial gut bacteria. These weren't just survival foods, they were nutritional powerhouses that complemented grain-based diets perfectly. Protein from decay. The final category might be hardest for modern people to accept, but medieval peasants regularly ate insects and larvae. This wasn't starvation eating, it was recognizing a reliable, nutritious protein source. When you split open rotting logs, you often find fat, white beetle larvae. These grubs are actually incredibly nutritious, higher in protein than beef, and rich in healthy fats. Look for softly rotting hardwood logs where the larva will be in chambers throughout the wood, especially where the wood is soft but not completely decomposed. The standard preparation method was simple: roast them over a fire until they're crispy outside and tender inside. Medieval accounts describe them as sweet and nutty when cooked properly. Beyond beetle larvae, dead trees host various other edible insects that medieval people would systematically harvest by breaking apart rotting wood. These insects are protein powerhouses. For people on the edge of protein deficiency, a handful of grubs could provide essential amino acids and fats that plant foods couldn't supply. While this might seem extreme to us, medieval people weren't squeamish about food sources. They recognized that insects and larvae are simply another form of animal protein, and in situations where meat was scarce, these could make the difference between surviving and not surviving. Safety considerations for insect consumption were well understood in medieval times. They knew to avoid larvae found in animal carcasses or human waste, focusing instead on wood-boring species. Larvae that smelled foul or appeared diseased were rejected. Proper cooking was essential, not just for palatability, but to eliminate potential parasites and harmful bacteria. Different regions had varying approaches to insect consumption. In some parts of medieval Germany, roasted beetle larvae were considered such a delicacy that they were served at feast days. Monasteries in mountainous regions often included instructions for larvae collection in their survival manuals for times of siege or crop failure. Some communities even developed semi-cultivation techniques, maintaining rotting log piles specifically to encourage beetle infestations. From a nutritional standpoint, these larvae were exceptional foods. Wood-boring beetle larvae contain up to 20% protein by weight, along with all essential amino acids. They're particularly rich in lysine, an amino acid often deficient in grain-based diets. The fat content ranges from 10 to 15%, mostly in the form of beneficial unsaturated fats. Seaweed and aquatic plants. Here's something that will surprise you. Medieval Europeans didn't just look to the forest for emergency food. They had an entire relationship with the sea that we've completely forgotten. Archaeological evidence shows that Europeans had been eating seaweed and freshwater aquatic plants for over 8,000 years, and this continued well into medieval times. Irish moss, scientifically known as Chondrus crispus, became famous during the Irish potato famine, but medieval coastal communities had been using it for centuries before that crisis. During food shortages, they would add the dried seaweed to warm milk with honey, sugar, and spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, creating a nutritious drink that provided essential minerals and calories. Dulse was another crucial seaweed, a reddish-brown variety that could be eaten fresh off the rocks or dried for long-term storage. Medieval people knew it was packed with nutrients that land plants couldn't provide, especially iodine and trace minerals from seawater. The preparation methods were sophisticated. Seaweeds were cleaned carefully to remove shells and debris, then either eaten fresh, dried for storage, or boiled into broths. The process for preparing Irish moss was specific. First, rinse the dried seaweed thoroughly to remove sand and small sea creatures. Then soak it in cold water for about 20 minutes until it softened and expanded. After that, add it to warm milk or water and simmer gently for 5 to 10 minutes until it dissolved into a thick, gelatinous liquid. They would strain out any remaining seaweed pieces and add honey, spices, or whatever sweetener they had available. But it wasn't just coastal areas. Even inland communities harvested freshwater aquatic plants from lakes, rivers, and marshes. Watercress, wild mustard, and sorrel were commonly gathered during food shortages. These plants were often more nutritious than their land-based cousins because they absorbed minerals from the water. Lichens. Moving from water to the most unlikely places, medieval people knew how to extract nutrition from what looks like nothing more than crusty growths on rocks and trees. Lichens are actually a symbiotic organism, part fungus, part algae, and they can survive in the harshest conditions where nothing else grows. Iceland moss, despite its name, isn't actually a moss but a lichen, was a crucial food source in northern Europe and Scandinavia. During long winters, when other food sources were exhausted, people would harvest this lichen and prepare it in multiple ways: ground into flour for bread, boiled into porridge, made into pudding, or cooked as soup. But here's where it gets really interesting. In Arctic regions, people discovered an unusual protein source through lichens. Reindeer lichen is a staple food for reindeer and caribou. Northern peoples learned to harvest this lichen from the stomachs of freshly killed reindeer. The animals had already begun the digestion process, making the lichen more digestible for humans. The preparation of lichens required specific knowledge. Many species needed to be boiled repeatedly to remove bitter compounds, similar to the acorn leaching process. They would start by cleaning the lichens to remove dirt and debris, then soak them in water for several hours. Next came repeated boiling. Put the lichens in a pot, boil for 10 to 15 minutes, pour off the bitter water, add fresh water, and repeat this process several times until the water stayed relatively clear and the bitter taste was gone. Once processed, the lichens could be ground into flour using stones or cooked directly into porridge by continuing to boil them in milk or water until they broke down into a thick, nutritious mush. Regional variations were notable. In Scandinavia, Iceland moss was often mixed with milk or made into a thick porridge, while in mountainous regions, different lichen species were collected from high-altitude rocks where other plants couldn't survive. Clay and earth. Perhaps the most shocking category of medieval survival food was eating earth itself, a practice called geophagia. This wasn't random desperation, it was a systematic approach to dealing with extreme hunger that had specific rules and techniques. Medieval medical texts, including those by Trotula of Salerno in the 11th century, treated geophagia as a common but manageable problem. During the Great Famine of 1315-1317, chroniclers documented people mixing clay with whatever plant material they could find, tree bark, grass, spoiled grain, to create filling meals that would quiet the agony of empty stomachs. But clay wasn't just filler. Medieval people understood that certain types of clay had medicinal properties. Fine, clean clay could help settle upset stomachs and absorb toxins from other questionable foods they were forced to eat. They specifically sought out clay from termite mounds or certain riverbanks, avoiding contaminated soil from areas where animals lived. The preparation was careful and deliberate. First, they would select clay that was fine-textured and free of obvious contamination, usually clay that was white, red or yellow in color, rather than dark soil with organic matter. The clay would be cleaned of stones and debris, sometimes baked near the fire to dry and sterilize it, then ground into a fine powder using stones. This powder was then mixed with whatever food was available, stirred into thin porridge, mixed with cooked plant matter, or combined with water to make a filling paste. Different regions had different approaches. In some areas, red clay was preferred for its iron content, while in others, white clay was chosen for its supposed digestive benefits. Leather and organic materials. When every other food source was exhausted, medieval people turned to something that seems completely inedible: leather goods. This wasn't just gnawing on a boot, it was a systematic process of extracting nutrition from processed animal hide. Leather is essentially preserved animal skin, made up mostly of collagen protein. While normally indigestible, medieval people discovered that prolonged boiling could break down this collagen into a gelatinous broth that provided some calories and protein. They would take old shoes, belts, harnesses, or any leather goods and boil them for hours or even days until the tough material softened and released whatever nutrition it contained. The process required patience and precious fuel. First, they would clean the leather as thoroughly as possible, scraping off any dirt or external contamination. Then the leather would be cut into smaller pieces to help it cook faster and placed in pots of water. The key was maintaining a low, steady boil for many hours, sometimes up to 2 full days, until the tough leather broke down and the water became thick and gelatinous. The resulting liquid was described as foul-smelling and gluey, but it provided enough sustenance to keep someone alive another day. Records from the Great Famine specifically mention this practice, along with other desperate measures. People would also eat parchment, glue made from animal parts, and even the leather bindings of books. The nutritional value was minimal, but not zero. Collagen, when broken down through prolonged cooking, does provide some amino acids and calories that could mean the difference between life and death. They also provide significant amounts of calcium, iron, and B vitamins, nutrients that were often scarce during extended periods of plant-based eating. For medieval people facing protein malnutrition, these insects weren't just survival food, they were nutritional medicine. So there you have it, 10 categories of impossible food that kept medieval people alive through the worst famines in European history. Tree bark processed into flour and fried like bacon, mushrooms from dead trees dried and preserved for winter, poisonous seeds and nuts detoxified into nutritious flour, underground roots and tubers harvested at exactly the right time, protein-rich insects that provided essential nutrients when other sources failed, seaweed and aquatic plants that delivered crucial minerals from water sources, lichens harvested from the most barren rocks and trees, clay and earth systematically prepared to fill empty stomachs and absorb toxins, leather goods boiled into life-sustaining broths, even freshwater plants that modern people never consider as food sources. The deeper lesson here isn't just about individual survival techniques, it's about how medieval people developed a completely different relationship with their environment. They saw food sources everywhere because they had to. Their survival depended on this knowledge, so it was passed down through generations and constantly refined through the brutal feedback of famine and survival. Modern preppers spend thousands of dollars on freeze-dried meals and emergency food supplies, but medieval peasants could walk into any environment, forest, coastline, riverbank, even barren mountainside, and find enough food to survive indefinitely. They had turned the entire landscape into a vast, hidden pantry, from the depths of the ocean to the highest mountain peaks. This knowledge represents thousands of years of human ingenuity, trial and error, and the incredible adaptability that has allowed our species to survive in every environment on Earth. It's a testament to human resilience and our ability to find solutions in the most desperate circumstances. Understanding these techniques doesn't just give us survival knowledge, it gives us perspective on our modern abundance and a deep appreciation for the incredible journey that brought us to where we are today. It shows us that humans have always been remarkably creative when it comes to survival, and that the relationship between desperate circumstances and innovation has shaped much of our history.